30 seconds.
You have an Azure environment. You need to create a new Azure virtual machine from a tablet that runs the Android operating system. Solution: you use Bash in Azure Cloud Shell. Does this meet the goal? Explanation: with Azure Cloud Shell, you can create virtual machines using Bash or PowerShell. Azure Cloud Shell is an interactive, authenticated, browser-accessible shell for managing Azure resources. It provides the flexibility of choosing the shell experience that best suits the way you work, either Bash or PowerShell. You plan to create an Azure virtual machine. You need to identify which storage service must be used to store the unmanaged data disks of the virtual machine. What should you identify? Explanation: Azure Page Blobs are the backbone of the Virtual Disks platform for Azure IaaS. Both Azure OS and data disks are implemented as virtual disks where data is durably persisted in the Azure storage platform and then delivered to the virtual machines for maximum performance. Azure disks are persisted in Hyper-V VHD format and stored as a page blob in Azure Storage. Your company plans to move several servers to Azure. The company compliance policy states that a server named FinServer must be on a separate network segment. You are evaluating which Azure services can be used to meet the compliance policy requirements. Which Azure solution should you recommend? Explanation: networks in Azure are known as virtual networks. A virtual network can have multiple IP address spaces and multiple subnets. Azure automatically routes traffic between different subnets within a virtual network. The question states that FinServer must be on a separate network segment. The only way to separate FinServer from the other servers in networking terms is to place the server in a different virtual network to the other servers. You plan to map a network drive from several computers that run Windows 10 to Azure Storage. You need to create a storage solution in Azure for the planned mapped drive. What should you create? Explanation: Azure Files is Microsoft's easy-to-use cloud file system. Azure File Shares can be seamlessly used in Windows and Windows Server. To use an Azure File Share with Windows, you must either mount it, which means assigning it a drive letter or mount point path, or access it via its UNC path. Unlike other SMB shares you may have interacted with, such as those hosted on a Windows server, Linux Samba server, or NAS device, Azure File Shares do not currently support Kerberos authentication with your Active Directory (AD), or Azure Active Directory (AAD) identity, although this is a feature we are working on. Instead, you must access your Azure File Share with the storage account key for the storage account containing your Azure File Share. A storage account key is an administrator key for a storage account, including administrator permissions to all files and folders within the file share you're accessing, and for all file shares and other storage resources, blobs, queues, tables, etc., contained within your storage account. You plan to implement an Azure database solution. You need to implement a database solution that meets the following requirements. Can add data concurrently from multiple regions? Can store JSON documents? Which database service should you deploy? Explanation. Azure Cosmos DB is Microsoft's globally distributed, multi-model database service. With a click of a button, Cosmos DB enables you to elastically and independently scale throughput and storage across any number of Azure regions worldwide. Azure Cosmos DB is a great way to store unstructured and JSON data. Combined with Azure Functions, Cosmos DB makes storing data quick and easy with much less code than required for storing data in a relational database. Your company plans to migrate all its network resources to Azure. You need to start the planning process by exploring Azure. What should you create first? Explanation. The first thing you create in Azure is a subscription. You can think of an Azure subscription as an Azure account you get billed per subscription. A subscription is an agreement with Microsoft to use one or more Microsoft cloud platforms or services, for which charges accrue based on either a per-user license fee or on cloud-based resource consumption. You can also use a trial subscription, but the subscription expires after a specific amount of time or consumption charges. You can convert a trial subscription to a paid subscription. You have an on-premises application that sends email notifications automatically based on a rule. You plan to migrate the application to Azure. You need to recommend a serverless computing solution for the application. What should you include in the recommendation? Explanation. Azure Logic Apps is a cloud service that helps you schedule, automate, and orchestrate tasks, business processes, and workflows when you need to integrate apps, data, systems, and services across enterprises or organizations. Logic Apps simplifies how you design and build scalable solutions for app integration, data integration, system integration, enterprise application integration, EAI, and business-to-business, B2B, communication, whether in the cloud, on-premises, or both. You plan to deploy a website to Azure. The website will be accessed by users worldwide and will host large video files. You need to recommend which Azure feature must be used to provide the best video playback experience. What should you recommend? Explanation. The question states that users are located worldwide and will be downloading large video files. The video playback experience would be improved if they can download the video from servers in the same region as the users. We can achieve this by using a content delivery network. A content delivery network, CDN, is a distributed network of servers that can efficiently deliver web content to users. CDNs store cached content on edge servers in point of presence, POP, locations that are close to end users, to minimize latency. Your company plans to deploy several million sensors that will upload data to Azure. You need to identify which Azure resources must be created to support the planned solution. Which two Azure resources should you identify? Each correct answer presents part of the solution. Explanation. IoT Hub, Internet of Things Hub, provides data from millions of sensors. IoT Hub is a managed service, hosted in the cloud, that acts as a central message hub for bidirectional communication between your IoT application and the devices it manages. Lake storage accounts are hierarchical namespace-enabled storage accounts built on top of blob storage. Both of these use blobs for their storage. You have an Azure web app. You need to manage the settings of the web app from an iPhone. What are two Azure management tools that you can use? Each correct answer presents a complete solution. Explanation. The Azure portal is the web-based portal for managing Azure. Being web-based, you can use the Azure portal on an iPhone. Azure Cloud Shell is a web-based command line for managing Azure. You access the Azure Cloud Shell from the Azure portal. Being web-based, you can use the Azure Cloud Shell on an iPhone. This question requires that you evaluate the underlined text to determine if it is correct. You have an application that is comprised of an Azure web app that has a service level agreement, SLA, of 99.95% and an Azure SQL database that has an SLA of 99.99%. The composite SLA for the application is the product of both SLAs, which equals 99.94%. Explanation. Composite SLAs involve multiple services supporting an application, each with differing levels of availability. For example, consider an app service web app that writes to Azure SQL database. At the time of this writing, these Azure services have the following SLAs. App service web apps equals 99.95%. SQL database equals 99.99%. For each of the following statements, select yes if the statement is true. Otherwise, select no. Each correct selection is worth 1 point. Explanation. Box 1. Azure resources deployed to a single resource group can be located in different regions. The resource group only contains metadata about the resources it contains. Box 2. Tags for resources are not inherited by default from their resource group. Box 3. A resource group can be used to scope access control for administrative actions. By default, permissions set at the resource level are inherited by the resources in the resource group. Your company plans to deploy an artificial intelligence (AI) solution in Azure. What should the company use to build, test, and deploy predictive analytics solutions? Explanation. Microsoft Azure Machine Learning Studio, Classic, is a collaborative, drag-and-drop tool you can use to build, test, and deploy predictive analytics solutions on your data. Azure Machine Learning Studio, Classic, publishes models as web services that can easily be consumed by custom apps or by tools such as Excel. Machine Learning Studio, Classic, is where data science, predictive analytics, cloud resources, and your data meet. This question requires that you evaluate the underlined text to determine if it is correct. Data that is stored in the archive access tier of an Azure storage account can be accessed at any time by using azcopy.exe. Explanation. Azure Storage offers different access tiers: hot, cool and archive. The archive access tier has the lowest storage cost, but it has higher data retrieval costs compared to the hot and cool tiers. Data in the archive tier can take several hours to retrieve. While a blob is in archive storage, the blob data is offline and can't be read, overwritten, or modified. To read or download a blob in archive, you must first rehydrate it to an online tier. For each of the following statements, select yes if the statement is true. Otherwise, select no. Each correct selection is worth 1 point. Explanation. Box 1. You can get security recommendations from the Security tab on the Advisor dashboard. Box 2. Advisor helps you optimize and reduce your overall Azure spend by identifying idle and underutilized resources. You can get cost recommendations from the Cost tab on the Advisor dashboard. Box 3. Azure Advisor does not provide recommendations on how to configure network settings on Azure virtual machines. For each of the following statements, select yes if the statement is true. Otherwise, select no. Each correct selection is worth 1 point. Explanation. Box 1. A PaaS solution does not provide access to the operating system. The Azure Web Apps service provides an environment for you to host your web applications. Box 2. A PaaS solution that hosts web apps in Azure does provide the ability to scale the platform automatically. Auto-scaling means adding more load-balanced virtual machines to host the web apps. Box 3. PaaS provides a framework that developers can build upon to develop or customize cloud-based applications. PaaS development tools can cut the time it takes to code new apps with pre-coded application components built into the platform, such as workflow, directory services, security features, For each of the following statements, select yes if the statement is true. Otherwise, select no. Each correct selection is worth 1 point. Explanation. Box 1. Traditionally, IT expenses have been considered a capital expenditure, CapEx. Today, with the move to the cloud and the pay-as-you-go model, organizations have the ability to stretch their budgets and are shifting their IT CapEx costs to operating expenditures, OPEX, instead. Box 2. Two virtual machines using the same size could have different disk configurations. Therefore, the monthly costs could be different. Box 3. When an Azure virtual machine is stopped, you don't pay for the virtual machine. However, you do still pay for the storage costs associated to the virtual machine. This question requires that you evaluate the underlined text to determine if it is correct. When you are implementing a software as a service, SaaS, solution, you are responsible for configuring high availability. Explanation. When you are implementing a software as a service, SaaS, solution, you are responsible for configuring the SaaS solution. Everything else is managed by the cloud provider. SaaS requires the least amount of management. The cloud provider is responsible for managing everything, and the end user just uses the software. Software as a service, SaaS, allows users to connect to and use cloud-based apps over the internet. Common examples are email, calendaring and office tools. You have an on-premises network that contains several servers. You plan to migrate all the servers to Azure. You need to recommend a solution to ensure that some of the servers are available if a single Azure data center goes offline for an extended period. What should you include in the recommendation? Explanation. Fault tolerance is the ability of a system to continue to function in the event of a failure of some of its components. Availability zones expand the level of control you have to maintain the availability of the applications and data on your VMS. Availability zones are unique physical locations within an Azure region. Each zone is made up of one or more data centers equipped with independent power, cooling, and networking. To ensure resiliency, there are a minimum of 3 separate zones in all enabled regions. The physical separation of availability zones within a region protects applications and data from data center failures. This question requires that you evaluate the underlined text to determine if it is correct. An organization that hosts its infrastructure in a private cloud can close its data center. Explanation. A private cloud is hosted in your data center. Therefore, you cannot close your data center if you are using a private cloud. A public cloud is hosted externally, for example, in Microsoft Azure. An organization that hosts its infrastructure in a public cloud can close its data center. What are 2 characteristics of the public cloud? Each correct answer presents a complete solution. Each correct selection is worth 1 point. Explanation. With the public cloud, you get pay-as-you-go pricing as you pay only for what you use, no capex costs. With the public cloud, you have self-service management. You are responsible for the deployment and configuration of the cloud resources such as virtual machines or websites. The underlying hardware that hosts the cloud resources is managed by the cloud provider. This question requires that you evaluate the underlying text to determine if it is correct. When planning to migrate a public website to Azure, you must plan to pay monthly usage costs. Explanation. When planning to migrate a public website to Azure, you must plan to pay monthly usage costs. This is because Azure uses the pay-as-you-go model. Your company plans to migrate all its data and resources to Azure. The company migration plan states that only Platform as a Service (PaaS) solutions must be used in Azure. You need to deploy an Azure environment that meets the company migration plan. Solution: you create an Azure App Service and Azure SQL databases. Does this meet the goal? Explanation. Azure App Service and Azure SQL databases are examples of Azure PaaS solutions. Therefore, this solution does meet the goal. Your company plans to migrate all its data and resources to Azure. The company migration plan states that only Platform as a Service (PaaS) solutions must be used in Azure. You need to deploy an Azure environment that meets the company migration plan. Solution: you create an Azure App Service and Azure virtual machines that have Microsoft SQL Server installed. Does this meet the goal? Explanation. Azure App Service is a PaaS, Platform as a Service, service. However, Azure Virtual Machines are an IaaS, Infrastructure as a Service, service. Therefore, this solution does not meet the goal. Your company plans to migrate all its data and resources to Azure. The company migration plan states that only Platform as a Service, PaaS, solutions must be used in Azure. You need to deploy an Azure environment that meets the company migration plan. Solution: you create an Azure App Service and Azure storage accounts. Does this meet the goal? Explanation. Azure App Service is a PaaS, Platform as a Service, service. However, Azure storage accounts are an IaaS, Infrastructure as a Service, service. Therefore, this solution does not meet the goal. Your company hosts an accounting application named APP1 that is used by all the customers of the company. APP1 has low usage during the first 3 weeks of each month and very high usage during the last week of each month. Which benefit of Azure Cloud Services supports cost management for this type of usage pattern? Explanation. Elasticity in this case is the ability to provide additional compute resource when needed and reduce the compute resource when not needed to reduce costs. Auto-scaling is an example of elasticity. You plan to migrate a web application to Azure. The web application is accessed by external users. You need to recommend a cloud deployment solution to minimize the amount of administrative effort used to manage the web application. What should you include in the recommendation? Explanation. Azure App Service is a Platform as a Service, PaaS, offering that lets you create web and mobile apps for any platform or device and connect to data anywhere, in the cloud or on-premises. App Service includes the web and mobile capabilities that were previously delivered separately as Azure Websites and Azure Mobile Services. Which cloud deployment solution is used for Azure Virtual Machines and Azure SQL databases? To answer, select the appropriate options in the answer area. Explanation. Box 1. Azure Virtual Machines are Infrastructure as a Service, IaaS. Infrastructure as a service is the most flexible category of cloud services. It aims to give you complete control over the hardware that runs your application, IT infrastructure, servers and virtual machines, VMS, storage, networks, and operating systems. Instead of buying hardware, with IaaS, you rent it. Box 2, Azure SQL Databases are Platform as a Service, PaaS. Azure SQL Database is a fully managed platform as a service, PaaS, database engine that handles most of the database management functions such as upgrading, patching, backups, and monitoring without user involvement. You have an on-premises network that contains 100 servers. You need to recommend a solution that provides additional resources to your users. The solution must minimize capital and operational expenditure costs. What should you include in the recommendation? Explanation. A hybrid cloud is a combination of a private cloud and a public cloud. Capital expenditure is the spending of money upfront for infrastructure such as new servers. With a hybrid cloud, you can continue to use the on-premises servers while adding new servers in the public cloud, Azure for example. Adding new servers in Azure minimizes the capital expenditure costs as you are not paying for new servers as you would if you deployed new server on-premises. For each of the following statements, select yes if the statement is true. Otherwise, select no. Each correct selection is worth 1 point. You plan to migrate several servers from an on-premises network to Azure. What is an advantage of using a public cloud service for the servers over an on-premises network? Explanation. The public cloud is a shared entity whereby multiple corporations each use a portion of the resources in the cloud. The hardware resources, servers, infrastructure etc., are managed by the cloud provider. Multiple companies create resources such as virtual machines and virtual networks on the hardware resources. After you answer a question in this section, you will not be able to return to it. As a result, these questions will not appear in the review screen. You plan to deploy several Azure virtual machines. You need to ensure that the services running on the virtual machines are available if a single data center fails. Solution: you deploy the virtual machines to 2 or more scale sets. Does this meet the goal? Explanation. This answer does not specify that the scale set will be configured across multiple data centers, so this solution does not meet the goal. Azure Virtual Machine scale sets let you create and manage a group of load-balanced VMS. The number of VM instances can automatically increase or decrease in response to demand or a defined schedule. Scale sets provide high availability to your applications, and allow you to centrally manage, configure, and update many VMS. You plan to deploy several Azure virtual machines. You need to ensure that the services running on the virtual machines are available if a single data center fails. Solution: you deploy the virtual machines to 2 or more availability zones. Does this meet the goal? Explanation. Availability zones expand the level of control you have to maintain the availability of the applications and data on your VMS. An availability zone is a physically separate zone within an Azure region. There are 3 availability zones per supported Azure region. Each availability zone has a distinct power source, network, and cooling. By architecting your solutions to use replicated VMS in zones, you can protect your apps and data from the loss of a data center. If one zone is compromised, then replicated apps and data are instantly available in another zone. You plan to deploy several Azure virtual machines. You need to ensure that the services running on the virtual machines are available if a single data center fails. Solution: you deploy the virtual machines to 2 or more regions. Does this meet the goal? Explanation. By deploying the virtual machines to 2 or more regions, you are deploying the virtual machines to multiple data centers. This will ensure that the services running on the virtual machines are available if a single data center fails. Azure operates in multiple data centers around the world. These data centers are grouped into geographic regions, giving you flexibility in choosing where to build your applications. You have 1,000 virtual machines hosted on the Hyper-V hosts in a data center. You plan to migrate all the virtual machines to an Azure pay-as-you-go subscription. You need to identify which expenditure model to use for the planned Azure solution. Which expenditure model should you identify? Explanation. One of the major changes that you will face when you move from on-premises cloud to the public cloud is the switch from capital expenditure, buying hardware, to operating expenditure, paying for service as you use it. This switch also requires more careful management of your costs. The benefit of the cloud is that you can fundamentally and positively affect the cost of a service you use by merely shutting down or resizing it when it's not needed. Match the Azure Cloud Services benefit to the correct description. Each correct match is worth 1 point. Explanation. Box 1. Fault tolerance is the ability of a service to remain available after a failure of one of the components of the service. Box 2. Disaster recovery is the recovery of a service after a failure. Box 3. Dynamic scalability is the ability for compute resources to be added to a service when the service is under heavy load. Box 4. Latency is the time a service to respond to requests. For each of the following statements, select yes if the statement is true. Otherwise, select no. Each correct selection is worth 1 point. Explanation. Box 1. No. It is not true that a company must always migrate from a private cloud model or must first have a private cloud to implement a hybrid cloud. You could start with a public cloud and then combine that with an on-premise infrastructure to implement a hybrid cloud. Box 2. Yes. A company can extend the computing resources of its internal network by using the public cloud. This is very common. When you need more resources, rather than pay out for new on-premises infrastructure. Box 3. No. It is not true that only guest users can access cloud resources. You can give anyone with an account in Azure Active Directory access to the cloud resources. For each of the following statements, select yes if the statement is true. Otherwise, select no. Each correct selection is worth 1 point. Explanation. Box 1. A resource can interact with resources in other resource groups. Box 2. Deleting the resource group will remove the resource group as well as all the resources in that resource group. This can be useful for the management of resources. Box 3. Resources from multiple different regions can be placed in a resource group. The resource group only contains metadata about the resources it contains. References. https://docs.microsoft.com/enus/azure/azure resource manager resource group overview https://www.codeisahighway.com/effective ways to delete resources in a resource group on Azure. Your company has an on-premises network that contains multiple servers. The company plans to reduce the following administrative responsibilities of network administrators: backing up application data, replacing failed server hardware, managing physical server security, updating server operating systems, managing permissions to shared documents. The company plans to migrate several servers to Azure virtual machines. You need to identify which administrative responsibilities will be eliminated after the planned migration. Which two responsibilities should you identify? Explanation. Azure Virtual Machines run on Hyper-V physical servers. The physical servers are owned and managed by Microsoft. As an Azure customer, you have no access to the physical servers. Microsoft manage the replacement of failed server hardware and the security of the physical servers, so you don't need to. For each of the following statements, select yes if the statement is true. Otherwise, select no. Each correct selection is worth 1 point. Explanation. Box 1, with the pay-as-go model, you pay for services as you use them. This is OPEX, operational expenditure, not CAPEX, capital expenditure. CAPEX is where you pay for something upfront. Box 2, a reserved instance is where you pay upfront for the use of a virtual machine for a period of time, 1 or 3 years. This can save you money as you receive a discount on the cost of a VM if you pay upfront for a reserved instance. However, as this is an upfront payment, it will be classed as CAPEX, not OPEX. Box 3, deploying your own data center is an example of CAPEX. This is because you need to purchase all the infrastructure upfront before you can use it. You plan to provision infrastructure as a service, IaaS. Resources in Azure. Which resource is an example of IaaS? Explanation. An Azure Virtual Machine is an example of Infrastructure as a Service, IaaS. Azure Web App, Azure Logic App and Azure SQL Database are all examples of Platform as a Service, PaaS. A team of developers at your company plans to deploy, and then remove, 50 virtual machines each week. All the virtual machines are configured by using Azure Resource Manager templates. You need to recommend which Azure service will minimize the administrative effort required to deploy and remove the virtual machines. What should you recommend? Explanation. DevTest Labs creates labs consisting of pre-configured bases or Azure Resource Manager templates. By using DevTest Labs, you can test the latest versions of your applications by doing the following tasks. You plan to deploy several Azure virtual machines. You need to ensure that the services running on the virtual machines are available if a single data center fails. Solution: you deploy the virtual machines to 2 or more resource groups. Does this meet the goal? Explanation. A resource group is a logical container for Azure resources. When you create a resource group, you specify which location to create the resource group in. However, when you create a virtual machine and place it in the resource group, the virtual machine can still be in a different location, different data center. Therefore, creating multiple resource groups, even if they are in separate data centers, does not ensure that the services running on the virtual machines are available if a single data center fails. For each of the following statements, select yes if the statement is true. Otherwise, select no. Explanation. A resource group is a logical container for Azure resources. When you create a resource group, you specify which location to create the resource group in. However, when you create a virtual machine and place it in the resource group, the virtual machine can still be in a different location, different data center. Therefore, creating multiple resource groups, even if they are in separate data centers, does not ensure that the services running on the virtual machines are available if a single data center fails. You plan to deploy several Azure virtual machines. You need to ensure that the services running on the virtual machines are available if a single data center fails. Solution: you deploy the virtual machines to a scale set. Does this meet the goal? Explanation: Platform as a Service, PaaS, is a complete development and deployment environment in the cloud. PaaS includes infrastructure, Euro servers, storage and networking, but also middleware, development tools, business intelligence, BI, services, database management systems, and more. PaaS is designed to support the complete web application lifecycle, building, testing, deploying, managing, and updating. Your company plans to deploy several custom applications to Azure. The applications will provide invoicing services to the customers of the company. Each application will have several prerequisite applications and services installed. You need to recommend a cloud deployment solution for all the applications. What should you recommend? Explanation: Infrastructure as a Service, IaaS, is an instant computing infrastructure, provisioned and managed over the Internet. The IaaS service provider manages the infrastructure, while you purchase, install, configure, and manage your own software. For each of the following statements, select yes if the statement is true. Otherwise, select no. Each correct selection is worth 1 point. Explanation: Box 1, an Azure AD tenant can have multiple subscriptions, but an Azure subscription can only be associated with one Azure AD tenant. Box 2, yes. Box 3, no, if your subscription expires, you lose access to all the other resources associated with the subscription. However, the Azure AD directory remains in Azure. You can associate and manage the directory using a different Azure subscription. For each of the following statements, select yes if the statement is true. Otherwise, select no. Each correct selection is worth 1 point. Explanation: Box 1, North America has several Azure regions, including West US, Central US, South Central US, East US, and Canada East. Box 2, a region is a set of data centers deployed within a latency-defined perimeter and connected through a dedicated regional low-latency network. Box 3, outbound data transfer is charged at the normal rate and inbound data transfer is free. Azure Cosmos DB is an example of a platform as a service, PaaS, offering. Explanation. Azure Cosmos DB is an example of a platform as a service, PaaS, cloud database provider.